EXW, X-Works. X-Works is one of the 11 standardized Incoterms, international commercial terms, published by the International Chamber of Commerce. So without further delay, let's delve into the details of EXW. Place or point of delivery. This rule places the minimum responsibility on the seller, who has to make the goods available, packaged accordingly at the specified place, usually the seller's factory or warehouse. Delivery and risk. The buyer will collect and load the goods onto his truck or container and be responsible for all export procedures, onward transport, and all costs arising after collecting the goods. For practicality, the seller is usually the one doing the loading. However, they are not obliged to load the goods, and this is at the buyer's risk if the seller does so. Mode of transport. It can be used for any transport mode or where there is more than one transport mode. Export clearance. Despite its simplicity, this rule presents many challenges for both parties when it is a cross-border transaction. Specifically, the seller or exporter will still need to be doing the export reporting. The buyer is obliged to undertake export procedures, obtaining licenses, security clearances, etc. In most cases, the buyer is ineffectively positioned to do this. As such, the seller is only obliged to assist at the buyer's risk and expense. However, the buyer using these terms usually appoints their freight forwarder or agent to handle the collection and export procedure. From the seller's perspective, there is the problem of obtaining evidence that the goods are to be exported. Where VAT or sales tax is charged on domestic sales, the tax authorities may require this. The seller will then need to liaise with the buyer or its agent to get a copy of the export documents. If the buyer wants to export the goods and anticipated the difficulty in getting the export clearance, it is best to use FCA, Free Carrier, rule. We will explain the FCA rule in the next video presentation. Order within the Incoterms 2020 rules. The Incoterms rules cover these areas of obligations, risk, and costs in a set of 10 articles, numbered A1, B1, etc. The A articles representing the seller's obligations, and the B articles representing the buyer's obligations. In Incoterms 2020, the internal order within each Incoterms rule now follows the sequence: A1, B1 general obligations, A2, B2 delivery taking delivery, A3, B3 transfer of risks, A4, B4 carriage, A5, B5 insurance, A6, B6 delivery transport document, A7, B7 export import clearance, A8, B8 checking packaging marking, A9, B9 allocation of costs, A10, B10 notices, A, sellers and, B, buyer's obligations, costs, and risks. A1. General obligations. The seller must prepare the goods and the commercial invoice, or its equivalent electronic message, in accordance with the sale contract and any other evidence of an agreement that the contract may require. B1. General obligations. The buyer must collect the goods when informed by the seller that the goods are ready. Refer to Article A2, Delivery, and Article A10, Notices. A2. Delivery. The seller must get the goods ready for the buyer to collect at a named place on the delivery date or within the stipulated place and time for delivery. B2. Taking delivery. The buyer must arrange the collection and take delivery of the goods as soon as it is ready under Article A2. A3. Transfer of risks. The seller, subject to the provisions of Article B3, Transfer of Risks, will bear all risks of loss or damage of the goods until the goods are placed at the disposal of the buyer according to Article A2. B3. Transfer of risks. The buyer bears all risks of loss of or damage to the goods from the time they have been put in place at his disposal in accordance with Article A2, provided, however, that the goods have been duly apportioned to the contract, that is to say, clearly set aside or otherwise established as the contract goods. Should the seller neglect to give notice according to Article B10, he will have to bear all risks of loss or damage to the goods from the agreed delivery date or the expiry date of any period established for taking delivery. A4. Carriage. The seller is not obliged to the buyer to make a contract of carriage. However, the seller must assist the buyer at the buyer's request, risk, cost, and information in the seller's possession, including transport-related security requirements that the buyer needs to arrange carriage. B4. Carriage. The buyer must arrange the carriage at its own cost to collect the goods from the named place of delivery. A5. Insurance. The seller is not obliged to the buyer to make a contract of insurance. However, the seller must assist the buyer, at the buyer's request, risk, and cost, any information in the seller's possession that the buyer needs for arranging the insurance. B5. Insurance. The buyer is not obliged to the seller to make a contract of insurance. However, it is in the buyer's interest to obtain its insurance. A6. Delivery transport document. The seller is not obliged to the buyer. B6. Proof of delivery. The buyer must give the seller documentation proof of having taken delivery. A7. Export-import clearance. Where applicable, the seller should assist the buyer, at the buyer's request, risk, and cost, to obtain documents and/or information related to all export transit-import clearance formalities required by the countries of export transit-import, such as export transit-import license, security clearance for export transit-import, pre-shipment inspection, and any other official authorization. B7. Export-import clearance. Where applicable, the buyer must perform and pay for all export transit-import clearance formalities as needed by the countries of export transit-import, like export transit-import license, security clearance for export transit-import, pre-shipment inspection, and any other official authorization. A8. Checking packaging marking. The seller must pay for the cost of those checking operations, such as checking quality, measuring, weighing, counting, necessary to deliver the goods in accordance with Article A2. The seller must package the goods at its own cost unless it is usual for the particular trade to transport the type of goods sold unpackaged. The seller must package and mark the goods appropriately as per agreements for collection by the buyer. B8. Checking packaging marking. The buyer is not obliged to the seller. A9. Allocation of costs. The seller must pay for all costs relating to the goods until they have been delivered according to Article A2, other than those payable by the buyer under Article B9, Allocation of Costs. B9. Allocation of costs. The buyer must pay for all the costs relating to the goods from the time they have been delivered under Article A2, reimburse all costs and expenses paid by the seller in providing assistance or information under Articles A4, Carriage, Article A5, Insurance, or Article A7, Export Clearance, pay, where needed, all duties, taxes, and other charges, as well as the costs of performing the customs formalities payable upon export, and pay the additional costs incurred when the goods are ready for collection or fail to give proper notification according to B10. A10. Notices. The seller must notify the buyer to enable the buyer to take delivery of the goods. B10. Notices. Whenever it is agreed that the buyer is entitled to determine the time within an agreed and/or the point of taking delivery within the named place, the buyer must give the seller sufficient notice. Recap: Ex Works, EXW, is a shipping arrangement in which a seller makes a product available at a specific location, usually at the seller's warehouse. The buyer has to pay for the transport costs. Once buyers have their goods, they are responsible for other risks, such as loading the goods onto trucks, transferring them to a ship or plane, and meeting customs regulations. Thank you for watching, and I hope the information provided in this video gives you a better understanding of the Incoterms rule for EXW. Do drop me your comments and let me know your thoughts. Coming soon, FCA, Free Carrier. To be the first to watch the next video, Please subscribe to my channel and click on the notification bell at the description below. Goodbye. From your trusted shipping guide. Revisit.